Today's guest on A Life and a Living is Gene Moran. Gene has got a fantastic and fascinating career. He was in the US Navy for a number of years, and he got to a very senior where he commanded a number of very large ships throughout that career. But he also, as ashore in the Navy, was involved with a lot of the administration, with Congress, and in the political scene in Washington, where it gave him great sight of how the whole world of companies trying to sell to government bodies, how that worked. When he left the Navy, he then became a lobbyist. So he went to the other side and saw it from that perspective. And now what he's done, he set up his own business where he really helps organizations to try and sell to the federal government. And it's a really fascinating, he's written a book called The Three-Ring Circus, hence the title of the podcast, but it's a real how-to in terms of how you approach it. And it's just fascinating to listen to Gene talk about, if you like, the sales process as defined within that world, and how you can just so easily miss the boat. And when RFEs are actually sent out, it's far too late to actually start thinking about, oh, I've got a product for that. So he talks about the whole process that you need to go through to understand it, how you start it, how you can, connect with allies to make your case and to strengthen your case going forward. And then the step-by-step process to actually get in and become a vendor to the federal government. Really, really fascinating. And also really understanding just from a purely sales process, in terms of understanding the process that they take. But also, once you get in, then it's actually also about relationship management, which we come back to time and time again. So I really encourage you to sit back and listen to the very interesting Gene Moran. Gene, it's great to have you here on A Life and a Living. I'm really thrilled that you have agreed to join us here and talk about your book, Pitching the Big Top, How to Master the Three-Ring Circus of Federal Sales. A great title, by the way, but it's also a good book, but I love the title. You're
John,
very welcome.
Thanks for having me.
No, listen, it's great. Just giving you a little bit of background. I mean, you had a long and very successful career in the US Navy, where you commanded many ships, but you also, while you're in the Navy, you worked ashore and in Navy headquarters, where you're advising secretaries of the Navy on the whole legislative side and budget negotiation with Congress, which is really kind of it must have been a really interesting, almost kind of, here I am, I'm still within the Navy, but I'm doing something which is completely different. But, then you were on loan to Congress, which gave you an extraordinary insight to both kind of the national and international leaders. And I'm just wondering, going from the Navy, which I can imagine, I'm guessing, because I haven't had the experience, where it's, it's very structured, it's very clear, it's very precise. And then you go into kind of something like dealing with Congress, which I'd imagine is not as structured or not as precise in many ways. Was that a big culture shock and shift for you?
It's a great question. And it was a unique opportunity for sure. I had command of a ship when I had the opportunity to participate in what's known as a fellowship, to serve in a congressional office for a one-year period. It's actually common across government agencies to share talent in an effort to cross-pollinate experiences. What jumped out at me was how flat the organization is in Congress. It appears to be quite elaborate and arcane in that there are multiple committees, but within those committees and within a personal office, there are really only one or two layers between the principals and the people that work on the decisions. Whereas in the Pentagon, there are layers and layers of committees and flag officers and decision makers and decision enablers and decision influencers. And so the Department of Defense might take a very long time and go through many people to come to a decision, whereas in Congress, a much smaller group of people can come to an equally compelling decision or solution. It was an eye-opener.
I can imagine, but you know, the other thing I find fascinating is that having left the Navy, and if somebody said, you know, well, what is the kind of logical progression for somebody who's been in the Navy? Being a lobbyist would not have been the first thing that would come to my mind, I have to say. But it also became very clear to you that companies who were trying to sell their wares, you know, didn't actually understand the process of federal funding. But being a lobbyist, that must have been again a huge shift in terms of way of working.
It's very interesting, John. When I did my congressional fellowship, I would take meetings where lobbyists would come to the office to present a particular issue or to try to educate us on something. And in that setting, I did not see myself as a lobbyist in my future. It really didn't come to me like that. I knew I still had time left in the Navy at that time, and in fact, I did go back to serve in the Navy and commanded another ship, and came back to another Pentagon tour. But it was my final tour in the Navy where I ran the Navy Senate Liaison Office, where I was now senior enough and considering the possibility of working outside the Navy. And I came to see that what I knew really had utility and marketability within multiple defense companies. So I like to say that the barrier to entry into industry looked pretty appealing to me at that point. But then the recognition that what I understood, the people I knew, and how the process worked could really help companies do a better job in what they were trying to do for the government. So it was a natural fit.
Yeah, I mean, having read your book, which is a really really good how to book, what you say in the book there that you know, being a lobbyist is the same as being a salesperson. Firstly, I was just wondering how many lobbyists would feel about you actually describing them as such. But is that how they are seen? Is that how they perceive? I appreciate they've got a product, a concept, an idea to sell, but is that how they see themselves, and is the process very similar for them?
They may not use the word sales, but it is about educating and trying to shape an outcome or to influence an outcome to a more favorable position for whatever reason. The companies that I work with today, we're trying to help the government get to a better place by either using a particular capability or a service or a solution that the government fundamentally wants, but they don't quite understand what all is out there and available to them. There are sales aspects to it in that it requires relationship building and coming forth with credibility in how you present yourself and what you're trying to solve. So I see comparisons. Not all lobbyists are the same, and
Sure.
you know, that's my take on it.
Yeah. I mean, the promise that you make in the business is that you help clients achieve outsized results when selling to the federal government, which is quite a promise. But the other thing that you say is that, you know, which I thought was really interesting, is that most companies sell their products or services at the wrong end of the acquisition and contracting process. Maybe you might just unpack that a little bit for me.
Sure. So when people are looking for a federal opportunity, they're often looking for what is the government advertising that they need? And they do that advertising through requests for proposal or requests for information. And at that point, the government is ready to buy something. They're about to put something on contract, and they just want to know who can provide this capability for me. But my time in the Navy and in the Pentagon and in budgeting and in Congress showed me that long before that contract opportunity comes about, many steps took place to put that funding in position. There was a need, there was a requirement. Somebody made a decision that they wanted to apply resources to the requirement. So it then falls into a budget. The budget has to be approved at multiple levels within the Pentagon, and then over in the White House, and then in Congress, and then back to the agency. And then it enters the acquisition phase where they start to look at who is out there that could provide a capability. That end-to-end process can take years. And I've had exposure along that entire spectrum to how that process works. Most companies do not have that kind of understanding of the end-to-end process. And so because I'm so confident in my ability to help align a company along that process, perhaps through multiple years of opportunities, near, mid, and long term, I'm confident that I can suggest that I can get them to a better place than they'll get on their own.
Okay. So at the time that the RFP, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that the RFP gets published or issued, whatever it might be. If now I'm saying, oh, wow, I can actually provide that, that's just too late, isn't it?
You're very late, no doubt about it. And somebody else probably already sees their name on that opportunity. There may be a couple of people that see their name on that opportunity. Right. But yeah, if you're waiting for the RFP, you're late to the party.
Okay. So what must you do before that? Because I mean, you don't know what you don't know. So you can't know that this RFP is coming down the line. How do you get yourself into the frame that you're positioned for when the RFP gets issued?
Well, any company has to know something about the customer that they're selling to. And in this case, the customer I'm referring to is within an agency. In a larger frame, the customer is really a constellation of people, because in government, it's not one person that makes a decision. It's many people who make a decision. But you have to have an understanding of where there is a need in the field or out in the fleet or just at the operating level. There must be a need. That need has to then be validated with a requirement. And a requirement is sort of a headquarters term that says, yes, we really do validate that that's a legitimate need, and we're going to put resources on that. If a company doesn't have that awareness of how the end user will use their product, they're going to struggle, because you have to have some familiarity there. You may have the greatest thing in the world that can solve a problem, but that operating force or that field end user needs to know that it exists, and they need to test it and play with it and understand it. When you're able to make some of those things happen, you can then get the snowball started down the funding and resourcing path.
Okay, and you talk about, I mean, it's that the book is called How to Master the Three Ring Circus, and the three rings of the sale are the Congress, the industry, and the agency. Can you just elaborate on just how they interact and how you actually need to understand all three?
Sure. Back in the Eisenhower days, there was a fear of the Iron Triangle, which was essentially the industry lock on the federal government, and how much control industry was coming to have. But I came to recognize through my Navy work and my congressional work and corporate work that really there are these three rings of influence where many things are happening in relative motion. And so the title of the book was not a pejorative that Washington, D.C. is a circus, but rather that there are many things happening at once across those three rings of influence. Not all of them matter to the same degree at the same time. They're all moving relative to one another. Underpinning these three rings are fiscal years that are unfolding in a perpetual fashion, typically fiscal year 1, 2, and 3 sequentially. And so when you can understand that those things are moving in relative motion, and that there's a process moving through the rings along a timeline, it can help you think differently about how you approach your portion of what I call the customer constellation. These various decision makers that live in all three rings that have a say in ultimately what will the government buy. Many companies don't take that holistic approach, and they go for a pinprick at what is a very complex process.
The other thing you talk about is that as you're kind of navigating your way through that is about not working alone and finding allies. How do you determine who are the right allies for you to engage with, or how do you decide what are the types of allies that you really should be engaging with?
Yeah, it would be a different answer depending on the situation or the technology. There are very large primes that have a big stake in federal outcomes. This past year, Bloomberg government put out their top 200 federal contractors, and the top 200 take home about half of all federal opportunities. That means there are many thousands in the bottom half to work for the rest. Some of those very large companies don't have perfect visibility on new technology or on new opportunities. And so sometimes it's in their interest to partner with a smaller company. The advantages that a large company has is they have many contracts on which things may be added to or adjusted. A smaller company can take advantage of the overhead resources that a large company has, and so can maybe be that partnership might be a way in for somebody who is relatively new to the federal opportunity or hasn't quite grown to the size where they can participate in multiple opportunities simultaneously the way a larger company can. There could also be a technology match where somebody has a piece that fits to a vertical application of a component to an assembly to a platform. That sometimes you see that sort of vertical integration in forming partnerships. So it really depends on the scenario, but as opposed to going it alone for the first time, it's a lot easier to go in alongside somebody who's done it before.
Yeah, otherwise you tend to stay in the bottom 50%. And I find it challenging to get out of that. It's very difficult. I mean, you were talking here about a process of how you actually go through that, but it's very hard to think about Washington and the politics of the whole world that is Washington, and you quote the late great Tip O'Neill, where he says all politics is local. But when you're in that Washington bubble, what does local actually mean in that environment, and how important is that all politics is local?
Well, I think there's a reason that phrase has been so often quoted. I think there is some reality to it in that people have to understand why something is important to them. It could be a constituent connection, meaning that the member has a geographic responsibility for where the company might be located. It could be that there are issues that the member is associated with. It could be any number of things. There are dozens of caucuses across Congress where people with common interest participate together. Could be a member from Wyoming with a member from Vermont with a member from Florida, but they have a common interest in, let's say, the National Guard. So there's a National Guard caucus that they participate in. It could be that a member has a particular fondness for infantry soldiers in the Army, and this is an issue that's near and dear to him because he might have lost a family member in some prior war due to lack of personal protective equipment. Let's just make an example here. Learning where some of those opportunity points might be can help when you're trying to tell your story to an audience that is in receive mode and is more open to a new idea. But those connections can come about in any number of ways, some of which you learn about by accident, some of which are widely known. But for a member or committee decision maker to change a position, you have to make it relevant to them.
It's One of the things you also talk about is this, is getting the timing right. And very often, if you're on the inside, it's easy to understand the timing. But if you're on the outside looking in, how do you figure out, apart from maybe hiring somebody like you, but how do you actually figure out that the timing is right to actually to go in and start your sales process?
Well, I mentioned fiscal years, and our government works on fiscal years that that unfold like clockwork. And at a particular time in a given fiscal year, the budget is in a particular position. So today we're executing fiscal year 21, meaning the budget has gone all the way through the process, and there is cash in somebody's checkbook in an agency to write checks. But the fiscal year 22 budget, the next year's budget, today has not even arrived in Congress. It should have been there by now, but it's not there yet. It's over in the White House in the Office of Management and Budget. The fiscal year 23 budget is still being prepared at the agency level. And it's interesting that it's being prepared at the agency level such that it will move forward to the Office of Management and Budget by the, let's say, December is a typical time. Decisions will be in that FY23 budget based on imperfect information that has yet to be approved for fiscal year 22 because that budget hasn't arrived in Congress, and fiscal 21 hasn't finished executing yet, so we don't know how did we really do. And so there's this perpetual house of cards that it rises and falls a little bit at a time. But the process does unfold in relative motion in the same sequence every year. But if you're not attuned to that, you'll miss that it has moved from one place to another. And so you may knock on a door, you may get a meeting, you may make your case during the meeting, and you'll get a thank you for coming sort of response. And and you won't know, because you didn't know how to interpret the signals, that you were in the wrong place in the wrong time. And so in that scenario, the company gave away credibility needlessly, and sadly likely won't get the next meeting.
We often, I mean, you talk about House of Cards, and just reminds you of the kind of the series of that name, which is probably unfortunate. But I mean, Washington is often, you often hear the comment as referred to as the swamp, and but I mean, whether that's accurate or inaccurate is kind of irrelevant. But in the sense of concept that it's complicated, it's a lot of politics, it's a lot of maneuvering, all of that sort of stuff. How do you navigate? I mean, is having somebody like you so critical to navigate the challenges, the difficulties, not associating with the wrong person or the wrong side? How do you navigate? Because it must be really difficult to navigate.
Well, there are people who are lobbyists who are primarily relationship lobbyists, in that they have a connection to somebody in a particular position. Or they came from a particular committee of relevance, and so they may have some real specific expertise in an area. I primarily focus on defense and security, and the national security world is generally not apolitical, but they tend to walk down the center. It's not extremely partisan. It is relatively bipartisan. We saw some change in the last few years in the world of intelligence, where that got a little politicized. But in defense, it is generally less political than the hyperpartisanship that we see, advertised in the cable news. I try to guide clients down that middle path, that this is not about extremes. We're focused on a process. We're focused on getting to an outcome to help solve a government need. We're trying to produce a good government solution. And I don't get swayed too far off of that center. There are members, Republican and Democrat, that I have relationships with, and their staffs. But I am not what would be identified as a relationship lobbyist. I'm more of a process lobbyist to help get to the good government solution.
It strikes me also kind of looking at what you map out there. I mean, obviously it's a complex process, and that's probably somewhat of an understatement, and it's a long process. But should you actually follow that process and be successful and get in, and you start, doing business and transacting business, what does it take to actually stay there? Or are you always kind of back in at your starting from point zero again? Or, are you actually kind of in that inner circle? Now, the 50% you talk about, would suggest that there is an element of kind of once you're in, you're in. But is it very challenging to stay in once you're in?
You have to perform. You have to be delivering as you said you would. You have to deliver a product that does what you said it would do. You have to deliver to a cost and timing schedule. And when you do that, you establish what's recognized as prior performance. Prior performance is then subsequently included in future evaluations that you might submit as part of a proposal. You can build on that track record. You can also lose that pretty quickly with a demonstration of poor performance. Sometimes those can happen in spectacular ways with a failure that nobody anticipated or was engineered incorrectly. But if you're delivering, you begin to establish credibility. You have to speak truthfully. I use the term credible witness. When I bring a company president forward to talk about a capability, I want them to be seen as a credible witness, that what they say is factual. They know what they're talking about. They're not making things up. They can go 2 and 3 layers deep very easily. They can think big picture. They can put themselves in the other person's shoes. People that have that ability to communicate with that sort of depth tend to convey integrity and credibility, and that just builds on itself time after time.
Still a relationship business, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
At the end of the day, I mean, I think what you do is fascinating. I must admit that, if I were ever kind of going down that route, I would certainly want to have Eugene by my side guiding me, because I could see myself making all sorts of dreadful mistakes in that process. Not the least of which is not knowing exactly how it starts or how to get going. But it's a fascinating story, and the service you provide is really interesting, and the insight you provide. Before we wrap up and you can tell people how they can get in touch with you, just curiosity, a book that other than your own, that you have read that's made an impact upon you?
I am a fan of a guy named Admiral McRaven. Some may recognize that name as the admiral in charge of the Special Operations Command who oversaw the capture of Osama bin Laden. He actually did many, many other things in his career, and he has a couple of books that are out that are very well worth the read. One is called Make Your Bed, and it's a very small book, but it's derived from a commencement speech he gave, I believe, at the University of Texas. Make Your Bed. It's fundamentally about how to start your day, and you'll be ready for anything. It's far more complex than simply making your bed. But his other book is called Sea Stories, and it just walks through some remarkable experiences that he had on his, I think, 40 years of active duty. He rose to 4-star rank, and it's amazing how he was in the right place at the right time, and recognized in the moment what was happening, and was in a position to make a difference on many, many things that had international impact. Both books are incredibly well written. I personally think he is a very credible person, and a great leadership model. So Admiral Bill McRaven is his name.
I've heard of the book Make Your Bed, and I've often heard it being referred to. So that is one that I heard, but I haven't heard of the other one. So that's one that goes on the reading list. Gene, before we wrap up, how can people get in touch with you? We'll put everything in the show notes and all of that, but if people are listening, how can they reach out and get in touch with you?
Well, thanks, John. I have a website, capitalintegration.com. That's capital with an O for our nation's capital in the United States. And I'm also on the, I have an app at your app store. Just look at Gene Moran. It's a little quick look at me and what I do and what I provide. Either way can work, and you'll eventually get to me.
Oh, great. Gene, thank you so much indeed. I apologize for taking longer than I said I would, but this has been really great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, John. I enjoyed it.